Hi, I'm Rahul. Welcome to HOA Revenge Lab, sharing real style HOA drama, stories, and satisfying revenge moments. The craziest part about inheriting land is that people immediately assume they can take advantage of you the second they think you're inexperienced. Bro, hearing stories like this always blows my mind because it proves that some HOA boards genuinely believe they're above actual law. And this one escalated so hard that an entire luxury HOA community basically walked itself into financial disruption because they underestimated one quiet guy who inherited a massive valley. In the middle of nowhere, what started as a peaceful inheritance from a grandfather turned into a years-long legal war involving property rights, easement manipulation, county corruption accusations, fake environmental complaints, aggressive fines, security harassment, and eventually one of the most brutal forms of malicious compliance I've ever heard in my life. And the best part, every single thing that happened was technically legal. That's exactly how people act in real life when money and entitlement get involved. The HOA thought they could bully one landowner because he looked isolated and inexperienced. Instead, they accidentally picked a fight with someone who understood contracts better than they did, and by the end of this story, multi-million-dollar homes lost access to the valley roads, residents started panicking, and the HOA board basically imploded from inside. Honestly, when I first heard this situation, I thought there was no way it could possibly end the way it did, but the deeper the story goes, the more insane it becomes. And it all started with a single inheritance letter and 3,000 acres nobody thought mattered anymore. 2. The entire situation began after the narrator's grandfather passed away at 86 years old, leaving behind a gigantic stretch of mountain valley land that most of the family considered useless. The property sat several hours away from the nearest major city and stretched across forests, rivers, abandoned ranch roads, and open grazing land that had been in the family since the late 1800s. Most relatives assumed the property would eventually be sold to developers because maintaining thousands of acres sounded impossible for one person. But the grandfather had specifically left the valley to his grandson because he was the only family member who actually visited consistently over the years. That detail turned out to matter more than anyone realized later. The grandfather had always warned him that land ownership wasn't about money first. It was about patience, paperwork, and understanding how people behaved once property values exploded. At the time, those warnings sounded overly dramatic. A few months later, they sounded prophetic. At first, inheriting the valley felt peaceful. The narrator spent weekends cleaning old cabins, repairing fencing, and cataloging decades of land records stored in dusty filing cabinets. Bro, this is exactly the kind of detail people ignore until it saves their entire future. Hidden inside those records were surveys, easement maps, mineral rights documents, water access agreements, and handwritten annotations dating back generations. Most people would have thrown those boxes away immediately. Instead, he organized everything carefully because his grandfather always insisted documentation mattered more than arguments. That habit would eventually become the single biggest weapon in the entire conflict. About 6 months after the inheritance, construction crews suddenly appeared near the southern edge of the valley. At first it seemed harmless. A luxury development company had purchased neighboring land and announced plans for an upscale, gated community designed for wealthy retirees and remote executives fleeing crowded cities. The advertisements described scenic mountain living, private trails, natural beauty, and peaceful exclusivity. Within a year, massive homes started appearing across the ridges bordering the inherited valley. Expensive SUVs filled the roads every weekend. Property values exploded almost overnight. The problem started when the newly formed HOA board began acting like the inherited valley belonged to them too. It began with small things. Residents crossed private ranch roads without permission. Hikers left trash near streams. Drones flew over cabins. ATV riders cut through grazing fields. At first, the narrator handled things politely because he assumed people simply didn't understand where property boundaries existed. Signs were installed, fences were repaired, friendly notices were mailed to the HOA management office. But instead of improving, the situation got worse. Way worse. The HOA board apparently believed the valley should become a shared natural recreation space for community residents because marketing brochures featured scenic photographs taken from nearby ridgelines overlooking the inherited property. That's exactly how entitlement starts in these stories. Somebody buys an expensive house and suddenly believes scenery equals ownership. Several residents began openly claiming that historical access roads automatically gave them recreational rights across the valley. Others argued the narrator should support community integration because the HOA had increased regional property values. Imagine inheriting your grandfather's land only for strangers to explain why you owed them access to it. Full bro, that level of arrogance is honestly incredible, and things escalated when the HOA sent an official letter demanding maintenance improvements on a gravel road running through the inherited property. The board claimed the road served as an important secondary emergency access route for the gated community and therefore needed upgrades, meeting HOA safety standards. The narrator was completely confused because he had never signed any agreement involving the HOA whatsoever. After reviewing county maps, he discovered the truth. Decades earlier, a narrow emergency easement had been granted to the county for wildfire evacuation purposes only. It did not provide public recreational access. It did not grant HOA control. And it definitely did not require private maintenance upgrades. When he rejected the demand, the HOA board turned hostile almost immediately. Residents started filing anonymous complaints with county offices claiming the valley contained unsafe structures, environmental violations, and illegal agricultural activity. Inspectors began appearing constantly. One week it involved water runoff accusations. The next week involved wildlife preservation concerns. Then came noise complaints despite the property being miles from most homes. That's the thing about organized HOA harassment. They rarely attack directly first. They weaponize bureaucracy until people surrender from exhaustion. But the narrator didn't panic because of one massive advantage nobody in the HOA understood yet. He had years of documentation inherited from his grandfather, including detailed easement contracts and archived pony correspondence proving the valley's legal protections were extremely specific. While sorting through old files one night, he found something shocking buried inside a folder from the early 1980s. 5. The emergency access easement included a conditional maintenance clause stating that if the easement holder interfered with agricultural operations, restricted landowner use, or attempted unauthorized expansion beyond emergency purposes, the easement could be legally challenged and potentially revoked through county review. Bro, the second he found that document, the entire power dynamic changed. Instead of continuing informal conversations with the HOA, the narrator hired a property attorney specializing in rural access disputes. The lawyer immediately noticed something disturbing. The HOA had quietly begun treating the emergency road like a permanent shared use access point. Despite having no authority to do so, security contractors hired by the HOA were even patrolling near portions of the inherited property while warning residents that community trail systems extended through sections of the valley. None of this was legally accurate. The attorney advised complete documentation of every violation moving forward. And that's when the narrator started playing the long game. Cameras were installed across road entrances. Every unauthorized vehicle crossing was logged. Every trespassing incident was documented. Drone footage recorded illegal trail cutting through protected creek areas. Meanwhile, the HOA became more aggressive because they assumed constant pressure would eventually force cooperation. Residents began posting online complaints calling the narrator selfish for hoarding natural land access. Some even accused him of damaging community property values by refusing recreational partnerships. Honestly, hearing people complain about somebody else owning their own property is one of the most absurdly realistic things. People lose their minds the second boundaries inconvenience them. Then the HOA board made the single worst mistake possible. 6. During a community expansion meeting, the board approved preliminary plans for a new luxury housing section requiring increased reliance on the emergency road running through the inherited valley. Construction proposals describe future utility routing, regular maintenance schedules, and expanded accessibility needs. In other words, they officially documented intentions to transform a limited emergency easement into functional daily infrastructure, and legally, that changed everything. The narrator's attorney immediately filed challenges with the county, arguing that the HOA had violated easement limitations for years while attempting unauthorized expansion of access rights. Suddenly, County officials who ignored previous complaints became very interested because liability concerns entered the picture. If the HOA knowingly exceeded easement permissions, future legal exposure could become massive. That's when panic quietly started spreading behind closed doors. But nobody in the neighborhood understood yet how far the narrator was willing to take things. And honestly, the next phase became absolutely brutal. Once the legal challenges officially reached the county offices, the atmosphere inside the valley changed completely. What had previously felt like annoying HOA harassment suddenly transformed into a full-scale territorial war. And honestly, this is where the story stopped feeling like normal neighborhood drama and started feeling like corporate sabotage mixed with rich people panic. The HOA board had spent years operating under the assumption that no individual landowner would ever push back hard enough to threaten an entire luxury development. The second county attorneys started reviewing easement violations. That confidence disappeared almost overnight. 7. The narrator began noticing changes immediately. Hoa representatives who once acted smug and dismissive suddenly became overly careful in emails. Community newsletters stopped mentioning shared valley access. Security patrols quietly disappeared from certain road sections, but behind the scenes, things were getting much uglier. Because once expensive developments become financially vulnerable, people start acting desperate. That's exactly how people behave in real life when millions of dollars are on the line. The first major escalation came through environmental accusations. Several residents filed coordinated complaints claiming the inherited ranch operations endangered protected wildlife habitats. Investigators arrived demanding access to inspect streams, grazing fields, and forest sections throughout the property. The timing felt suspicious because many complaints referenced nearly identical wording. Bro, hearing that would instantly set off alarm bells for anybody. It looked organized, and according to the narrator's attorney, coordinated complaints were a common pressure tactic used when HOAs wanted leverage without direct legal exposure. But once again, the HOA underestimated who they were dealing with. Because the narrator's grandfather had managed the valley for decades under agricultural preservation programs, there were already extensive environmental compliance records on file: soil inspections, water testing, grazing rotation documentation, wildfire prevention reports. Everything was organized with almost obsessive precision. Instead of uncovering violations, inspectors ended up complimenting the valley's environmental condition compared to neighboring developed land. That part honestly blew my mind. The luxury HOA community criticizing the ranch actually had worse runoff and erosion reports than the inherited property they kept attacking. And then things got even more embarrassing for the HOA. 8. During one inspection, county officials discovered unauthorized trail modifications crossing protected creek areas connected to the HOA side of the ridgeline. Residents had apparently expanded recreational hiking paths without proper permits while attempting to create easier access toward the valley. Suddenly, the people filing environmental complaints became subjects of environmental investigations themselves. That was incredible. The HOA tried weaponizing bureaucracy and accidentally redirected scrutiny back onto their own neighborhood. Naturally, the board blamed the narrator publicly. Community message boards exploded with accusations claiming he manipulated inspectors, targeted retirees, and intentionally damaged property values. Some residents even started portraying him as a greedy land baron trying to control nature. That wording alone tells you exactly how disconnected these people were from reality. Imagine inheriting family land only for strangers to accuse you of controlling your own property. It's honestly insane how entitlement rewrites people's thinking once luxury real estate enters the picture. And then came the road issue. The county requested updated usage data regarding the emergency easement crossing the valley, and the results were catastrophic for the HOA's position. Camera logs, vehicle records, maintenance reports, and security footage showed constant daily traffic completely unrelated to emergency access. Delivery trucks used the route. Landscaping crews used it. Contractors used it. Residents used it for recreational shortcuts. The easement had essentially become an unofficial community transportation route for years. Legally, that was a disaster. 9. The narrator's attorney argued the HOA had knowingly exceeded the easement scope while simultaneously interfering with agricultural operations through harassment campaigns and unauthorized access expansion. Worse, the attorney produced archived meeting records showing HOA planners discussing future development phases dependent on increased use of the Valley Road. Brough, it's the kind of evidence lawyers dream about finding. It basically proved intent. And suddenly, homeowners started getting nervous. Because most residents had no idea the HOA board had been operating inside such legally dangerous territory, people bought homes believing the scenic valley access was secure. Realtors had casually referenced nearby trails and emergency road convenience during property sales. Some homeowners even installed landscaping features specifically designed around valley-facing recreation access. Once rumors spread that county reviews could potentially restrict or revoke easement rights entirely, panic started moving through the neighborhood fast. Property forums turned chaotic. Residents blamed the HOA board for overstepping. Others blamed the narrator for refusing compromise. Some accused developers of misleading buyers during initial sales. Internal board meetings reportedly became hostile enough that one member resigned entirely after lawyers warned about personal liability exposure tied to unauthorized infrastructure planning. And that detail alone shows how serious things had become. Nobody quits a powerful HOA board unless they believe genuine legal danger exists. But the most unbelievable escalation happened next. 10. Without warning, construction crews hired by the HOA began attempting temporary stabilization work near sections of the Valley Road, claiming safety concerns required immediate maintenance upgrades. In reality, the work looked suspiciously like preparation for permanent widening. Gravel markers appeared. Survey flags spread through nearby fields. Equipment operators started clearing vegetation near drainage areas. The narrator shut everything down immediately. Emergency injunction filings hit the county within 48 hours. Drone footage documented every inch of unauthorized activity. Survey records exposed that several markers extended beyond easement boundaries entirely. And once county officials reviewed the evidence, they issued temporary restrictions halting all road-related modifications pending formal investigation. And that moment changed the entire balance of power, because for the first time, the HOA realized the inherited valley owner wasn't bluffing, wasn't intimidated, and wasn't running out of patience. He was preparing to legally destroy the one thing holding their entire luxury development together. And the revenge phase was about to become absolutely merciless. The revenge phase started quietly, which honestly made it even more terrifying for the HOA board. There was no dramatic confrontation, no screaming matches, no viral neighborhood meltdown. Instead, the narrator and his attorney executed everything through contracts, county hearings, and enforcement motions so precise that the HOA barely realized how trapped they were until it was already too late. Bro, this was the definition of weaponized patience. 11. After months of evidence reviews, the county concluded that the HOA had repeatedly exceeded the emergency easement's legal limitations while interfering with protected agricultural operations. That finding triggered a formal reevaluation process for the road agreement itself. And because the original easement contained conditional protections written decades earlier by the narrator's grandfather, the county suddenly had grounds to suspend all non-emergency usage pending litigation. Panic exploded across the development instantly. Daily commuter access vanished. Contractors lost entry routes. Landscaping schedules collapsed. Homeowners discovered alternate mountain roads added nearly an hour to travel times. Property listings started quietly disappearing from real estate sites. That was incredible to watch unfold because the HOA spent years acting untouchable, only to realize one overlooked contract clause could financially cripple an entire luxury community. And the narrator, he simply locked the gates and followed the law exactly as written. Once access restrictions officially took effect, the HOA community began collapsing from the inside faster than anyone expected. Residents who originally supported the board suddenly demanded answers after realizing their property values had dropped almost immediately. Bro, that's exactly how these situations always go. People cheer aggressive HOA behavior until the consequences finally affect them personally. Emergency board meetings turned chaotic as homeowners accused leadership of hiding legal risks for years. Several families even threatened lawsuits against the HOA itself after discovering the valley access had never been guaranteed the way realtors and community advertisements implied. 12, meanwhile, the narrator stayed almost completely silent publicly, and honestly, that made the outcome even more satisfying. He never celebrated online, never mocked residents, and never acted vindictive in public hearings. He simply enforced the original agreements exactly as they were written decades earlier. That level of restraint was honestly incredible, considering how much harassment he endured. Eventually, the HOA agreed to a settlement involving strict access limitations, environmental restoration payments, and permanent legal acknowledgement that the valley remained entirely private property. Some board members resigned shortly afterward, while developers quietly abandoned future expansion plans altogether. And just like that, the inherited valley finally became peaceful again, because one landowner refused to let entitlement rewrite ownership rights. Honestly, stories like this are the perfect reminder that paperwork matters more than intimidation. Bro, hearing how an entire HOA tried to pressure one landowner into surrendering private property rights just because they assumed he was isolated is absolutely insane. But what makes this story so satisfying is that the narrator never needed revenge in the dramatic movie-style sense. He didn't scream, threaten, or break rules. He simply stayed patient, documented everything, and used the law exactly the way it was originally written. That's exactly how real power works in situations like this. Entitled people usually expect emotional reactions because they think pressure automatically creates surrender. Instead, the HOA accidentally pushed someone who understood contracts better than they did. 13, and honestly, the grandfather deserves credit too. Those old easement records, handwritten notes, and preserved documents literally protected generations of family land from being absorbed into a luxury development. That part blew my mind because most people would have ignored those dusty boxes completely. If this HOA revenge story shocked you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with the craziest HOA or neighbor horror story you've ever heard. And trust me, the next story gets even wilder.